not forgotten. It had been collected, logged, sealed in an evidence bag, and stored in the property room of the Tompkins County Sheriff's Office in Ithaca, New York, sometime in the late autumn of 1991. A single brown work glove, right hand, size large, found in the storm drain grate at the corner of Elm Street Extension and Burley Drive on the morning of November 14th, found by a city public works crew doing seasonal drain clearing, who turned it in because there was something about where it was and how it was that did not feel like an accident. Pressed flat against the grate from the inside. Like something put there, not something dropped. For 32 years, the glove sat in its bag on its shelf. The case it belonged to went cold and stayed cold and accumulated. The particular institutional silence of things that cannot be explained and therefore stop being asked about. The detective who first held that glove retired in 2009. The family of Patricia Ann Whelan waited, because waiting was the only thing they had left to do. Then, in April of 2023, a forensic technician named Dara Novak ran a new extraction protocol on a piece of evidence that had not been successfully processed since 1992. And the glove finally gave up what it had been holding. What it named and who had been living in Tompkins County for 3 decades after Patricia died. And what the community of Ithaca did when it found out. That is a story about proximity and trust and the particular evil of a person who knows exactly how close he can stand to the fire without appearing to burn. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to November of 1991. Because to understand why the glove mattered so much, you first have to understand who Patricia Whelan was. Tompkins County in 1991 moved to the rhythms of a university town. Cornell perched on its hills above Cayuga Lake, the semester schedule marking time the way harvest did in agricultural counties. The whole region divided between the campus world and the working-class communities in the surrounding hollows and creek valleys that had been there long before any university and would be there long after. Ithaca was not a small town in the way that some of the communities in these scripts are small towns. It was complex, layered, politically engaged, the kind of place where a tenured professor and a dairy farmer's daughter could end up at the same diner counter and argue about the Cuomo administration over pie. Patricia Whelan belonged to the second of those two worlds, though she occupied both with ease. She was 34 years old in the fall of 1991, the oldest of 4 children raised in a Trumansburg farmhouse by a father who ran a commercial excavation business and a mother who had worked the registrar's office at Tompkins Cortland Community College for 20 years. Patricia had grown up between the two worlds that Tompkins County contained. She had gone to Ithaca College for 2 years before family circumstances brought her home, and had built a life in the county that was fully and deliberately her own. Working as a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses on the Commons, volunteering with the county literacy program on Tuesday evenings, raising a 7-year-old daughter named Becca with the specificity and the patience of a woman who did things entirely on her own terms. She had a 1989 Subaru wagon with a cracked rear taillight she kept meaning to fix. She had a standing Friday night order at Moosewood Restaurant that she had kept for 7 years. She kept a spiral notebook in her car where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. An overheard sentence, the name of a book someone recommended, observations about nothing in particular, and which she had been filling at the rate of about 1 notebook every 8 months since she was 22. There were 6 of them on her bookshelf at home, and an unfinished 7th in the glove box of the Subaru. On the evening of November 13th, 1991, Patricia had closed the bookkeeping work at the last of her 3 clients by 7:30, stopped at a convenience store on Route 96 where the clerk remembered her buying a bag of popcorn and a bottle of apple juice, and driven toward the house on Burley Drive where Becca was staying with Patricia's mother for the night. She never arrived. Patricia's mother, Helen Whelan, called the Burley Drive house at 9:45. when Patricia was more than 2 hours late and had not answered at her apartment. She called twice more before 10:30. At 10:30, she called Patricia's sister, who drove the route from the convenience store on Route 96 toward Burley Drive, and found the Subaru wagon on Elm Street Extension at 11:05, pulled to the curb at an angle that suggested a sudden stop rather than a deliberate park. The rear taillight was still cracked. The engine was cold by the time the first deputy arrived. The driver's door was unlocked. The 7th notebook was still in the glove box. Patricia's coat was on the passenger seat. By midnight, the Tompkins County Sheriff's Office had 2 units on the scene and a call in to the state police. By 2 in the morning, the temperature had dropped to 28 degrees, and the search parties were working by flashlight along both sides of Elm Street Extension. Patricia Whelan was found at 6:14 the following morning in a wooded area off a service road adjacent to the Burley Drive neighborhood, less than half a mile from where she had been going. The medical examiner was called. The investigation shifted from missing persons to homicide. The glove was found at 7:50 that same morning by the public works crew that had started their drain clearing route early. They were 4 blocks from the service road. The supervisor picked it up, looked at the drain grate, and drove it to the sheriff's substation himself, rather than logging it with the regular equipment return. He said later that he didn't know what it was exactly, but that it felt like something. He was right. The investigators who processed it found a partial DNA profile on the interior lining. Partial. Insufficient in 1991, and again when it was reprocessed in 1998, and again in 2004, for a definitive match against any sample in the available databases. The glove went back on the shelf. 3 blocks from where the glove was found, on Slaterville Road, a man named Walter Gruen had been renting a house since August of 1991. Nobody connected those 2 facts for 32 years. Detective First Sergeant Louise Farber of the Tompkins County Sheriff's Office had been assigned the Whelan case in 1992, inheriting it from the lead investigator who had been transferred, and she had carried it with a particular kind of professional stubbornness that her colleagues recognized but rarely commented on, because it was also, in her case, a personal matter. She had gone to Ithaca College with Patricia Whelan, a fact she had disclosed to her supervisors and which they had concluded did not disqualify her from the case, but rather made her more likely to stay with it. They were correct about that. In the first 2 years, the investigation developed 3 persons of interest. The first was Patricia's ex-husband, who had relocated to Rochester in 1989. He had a solid alibi for the evening of November 13th, confirmed by his employer and 2 co-workers, and was cleared. The second was a man named Gary Phelan, no relation to the victim, who had been involved in a parking dispute with Patricia at her office building 4 months before her death, and who had made a comment that 2 witnesses found threatening. Phelan was questioned, gave an account of his evening that investigators verified, and was eliminated by mid-1992. The third thread was vaguer and more frustrating. Several of Patricia's co-workers and friends described, when asked, a man who had been appearing on the edges of her life in the weeks before her death. Not anyone she had named or complained about, but a presence they had noticed, someone who had been in the Moosewood dining room on 2 consecutive Fridays. Someone a colleague thought she had seen once near the parking lot of one of Patricia's client offices. A face that didn't quite belong to any context. Nobody had a name. Helen Whelan, meanwhile, was raising Becca. She did it with the particular focused love of a grandmother who understood that the child was all she had left of her daughter. And she did it without ever, in any conversation recorded by anyone who knew her, suggesting that the search for Patricia's killer was anyone's responsibility, but the sheriff's department's, because that was what she believed. and she was not going to let bitterness about what had not yet happened compromise the one thing that had to remain intact. Her faith that it eventually would. Every November 13th, she lit a candle in the window of the Trumansburg farmhouse. Every year, without exception, for 32 years. Becca Whelan grew up in that farmhouse. She grew up watching the candle in the window. By 1999, 8 years on, Detective Farber had been promoted to a supervisory position that meant she could no longer work the Whelan case in any official capacity. She retained her personal file. She reviewed it in November. By 2009, when Farber retired after 31 years on the force, she took her copy of the Whelan file home. It was, she would tell her daughter, the only case she was leaving unfinished, and she did not intend to let it feel finished until it was. By 2015, 24 years after Patricia's death, the glove had been resubmitted to the state crime lab one more time. On the initiative of a junior investigator who had read about advances in touch DNA extraction, a technique that recovers genetic material from surfaces that a person has simply handled rather than from biological fluid samples. The results came back. The profile was richer than any previous extraction, but still not sufficient for a cold hit match in the available database. The profile was retained, updated, and stored. The glove went back to the shelf. By 2022, 31 years in, Walter Gruen was 63 years old, living on the same Slaterville Road property he had rented in 1991 and eventually purchased in 1998. He was known in the neighborhood as a quiet man who kept his property well and occasionally helped the family next door with their fence. He attended a Lutheran church in Cayuga Heights. He had worked for the same commercial landscaping company for 27 years. Nobody in Tompkins County in 32 years had ever given anyone a reason to look at Walter Gruen. That changed on a Tuesday morning in April of 2023. Every case on this channel is built from weeks of careful work, tracking down records, reading old files, and piecing together the lives of people who deserved better than what happened to them. If this is the kind of truth you believe is worth finding, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read everyone. Now let's get back to Patricia. Dara Novak had joined the New York State Police Forensic Science Unit in 2018 and had, in the 5 years since, developed a particular interest in cold case biological evidence, specifically in the question of what older samples might yield if subjected to extraction protocols that had not existed when those samples were first processed. She had written a departmental proposal in 2021 that identified 15 unresolved homicide cases in central and western New York whose biological evidence had been processed under pre-2010 protocols and which she believed merited resubmission. The Whelan case glove was on that list. The approval came through in the fall of 2022. The reprocessing began in February of 2023. The technique Novak's team used is called probabilistic genotyping, a process that applies statistical modeling to fragmentary or mixed DNA profiles, reconstructing a higher confidence genetic signature from evidence that older technology would have classified as insufficient. It works by comparing thousands of possible genetic configurations against the partial profile, assigning probability weights, and producing a composite that can be entered into the National CODIS database or compared against known samples with substantially higher accuracy than was previously possible. On April 11, 2023, the reprocessed profile from the glove interior was entered into the New York State DNA Databank. On April 19th, 8 days later, Dara Novak received a notification on her workstation at 8:43 in the morning. She read the name in the match field. She checked it against the address in the county records. Then she picked up the phone and called the Tompkins County cold case investigator assigned to the Whelan file, a detective named Raymond Cho. "I need you to pull the Whelan file," she said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The address in the match field was on Slaterville Road, 4 blocks from the corner of Elm Street Extension and Burley Drive, and it had been that address for 32 years. Walter Gruen had been arrested before. Once in 1987 in Chemung County, a misdemeanor assault charge that had resulted in a plea to a lesser offense, a fine, and a fingerprinting that placed his DNA profile in the state's databank. A databank that did not exist in 1991 and whose expansion and update protocols had not, in any reprocessing attempt before Dara Novak's, produced a profile from the Whelan glove that was complete enough to generate a hit. The 1987 arrest had been for a physical altercation at a bar in Elmira. The other party in that altercation had been a woman. Records show that between 1987 and 1991, Walter Gruen had lived in 3 different central New York counties. He had left each one within months of an incident, a complaint, an altercation, a matter that had been noted and not pursued. A woman in Schuyler County had filed a harassment complaint against him in 1989 that she later withdrew. In none of these cases had anyone connected the pattern, because the pattern existed in 3 separate county systems that did not communicate with each other, and because each incident had been resolved or dropped before it required escalation. He had moved to Ithaca in August of 1991. 3 months later, Patricia Whelan was dead. Detective Cho presented the DNA match, the address, the 1987 arrest record, and the county history to the Tompkins County District Attorney in May of 2023. A warrant was obtained. On June 7, 2023, at 6:20 in the morning, while the light was still gray on Slaterville Road and the neighborhood had not yet begun its day, Walter Gruen was taken into custody at the door of the house he had lived in for 32 years. A neighbor across the road stood on her porch and watched it happen. She said later that she had not known what to think. She said she had waved at that man hundreds of times. That is what the community of Ithaca and Trumansburg did with the news when it arrived. It stood on its porch and tried to reconcile what it knew with what it had just been told. Some people in that community remembered 1991. Some had known Patricia. Some had stood at the vigil that November and driven back to their houses past the corner of Elm Street Extension without knowing that the man 4 blocks away was already home. Walter Gruen was indicted on a charge of second-degree murder in July of 2023. He entered a plea of not guilty. In February of 2025, following a trial in Tompkins County Court, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life. He was 65 years old at sentencing. He did not speak at the sentencing hearing. Becca Whelan, 39 years old, spoke for 12 minutes. The courthouse was full. Patricia Ann Whelan kept a spiral notebook in the glove box of her 1989 Subaru wagon, because she was a person who paid attention and wanted to keep what she noticed. She had been filling those notebooks since she was 22 years old. There were 6 finished ones on her bookshelf and an unfinished 7th in the car. The 7th notebook is with Becca now. The last entry in it, made sometime in the week before November 13th, 1991, is a single sentence about the light on Cayuga Lake at dusk, and how it looked like something she needed a better word for. She was 34 years old. She had a Friday night table at Moosewood. She had a cracked taillight she kept meaning to fix. She had a 7-year-old daughter who grew up watching a candle in a farmhouse window every November and who stood in a Tompkins County courthouse in February of 2025 and said her mother's name out loud in the room where the truth had finally come to rest. The glove sat in its bag on its shelf for 32 years. A public works supervisor put it there because something about it felt like something. A forensic technician pulled it off the shelf in 2022 because she believed that old evidence could still speak if you asked it the right way. A detective 4 blocks from where Walter Gruen had lived for 3 decades received a name on a Tuesday morning in April and said 2 words into a telephone. None of these people knew each other. None of them planned what happened together. The truth found its way through a series of small, specific acts of attention. A supervisor who trusted his instincts. A technician who wrote a proposal. A detective who pulled a file, each one a link that held 32 years later when the chain was finally long enough to reach. I want to leave you with 3 questions before we close. Becca Whelan grew up without her mother and watched a candle in a window every November for 32 years. Does the conviction feel like justice to you? Or does the time itself represent a wrong that no verdict can address? The pattern Walter Gruen left across 3 counties in 3 separate filing systems was visible only in retrospect. What does that tell us about how we share information between jurisdictions? And what cases might still be sitting unseen inside that gap? And what do you make of the fact that the public works supervisor who found that glove drove it to the substation himself, on instinct, rather than logging it with the equipment return? How many cases turn on a single person deciding to pay attention? Justice found Patricia Whelan after 32 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth found this way still counts, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are in the description below. Thank you for being here.